The guard sergeant brought the cracked knife and was told that a new blade would cost 2 silver coins and 3 days' work. The young man by the wall took the knife without a word. He didn't have it reforged. He simply held it over the fire to heat it up and then cooled it in warm oil. That evening, the sergeant chopped a block of oak with that knife, and the blade didn't even waver. And 12 years ago, that knife was worse even when it was new. But let's rewind 3 days. The first thing he feels is pain, sharp, as if someone had driven a red-hot nail right into the back of his head. Then a smell, scale, sweat, sour beer. He opens his eyes and sees a soot-stained ceiling, low beams. This isn't the hospital. This isn't his apartment in Detroit. He tries to sit up, and his body responds with a stranger's pain. He raises his hands to his face and freezes. These aren't his hands. Wider at the wrists. Calluses not from a keyboard, but from a hammer. Skin darkened by ingrained soot. A face leans over him. An old man. A leather apron. A graying beard singed at one end. The old man shakes him by the shoulders and weeps. He calls out, "Ezra, my boy, you're back." And here, within a single mind, two lives collide. One belongs to Daniel Kane, 34 years old, an engineer at a tank design bureau in Detroit, an armor specialist. The last thing he remembers is the headlights on a concrete bridge pier, a crunch, darkness. The second life lies in his memory like a stranger's photo album. Ezra Kane, 22 years old, an orphan. 8 years as an apprentice to the blacksmith Orrin, hauling coal, pumping bellows, and all of this belongs to the dead boy whose body he now inhabits. The old man hands him a chipped mug of water. He takes it with both hands because his fingers are shaking. He gulps. The water is warm and tastes of iron. He looks around. A smithy. Walls of rough-hewn stone. A forge. Hand-operated bellows. An anvil on an oak block. And everything is so primitive that his chest tightens. He used to design assemblies for 40-ton machines, and now he looks at a forge where the melting temperature is controlled by eye. A smelting furnace. No blast furnace. 1,000 degrees at best. They don't even have a blast furnace here. A sword leans against the wall in the corner. Someone's commission. Crooked. You can even see the metal's pores from here. This is what they call a weapon here. And for the first time, he smiles slowly. Not out of joy, out of understanding. If this isn't a delusion, then he's fallen into a world stuck in the early Middle Ages, with soft steel, with knights and spears, and in his head lie blueprints for 20th century armored vehicles, iron-carbon phase diagrams, principles of alloying, calculations for sloped armor. In Detroit, he was one of hundreds of engineers. Here, it's worth more than gold, more valuable than the magic the old man mutters about. For 2 days, he barely gets out of bed, but his mind is working. He sifts through Ezra's memory like an archive, the kingdom of Verdun, feudal lords, knightly cavalry, war in the east against the nomads. A blacksmith is the lowest class. He must not look a knight in the eye for more than 3 heartbeats. He smirks. In Detroit, he shook hands with generals. Here, he has no right to raise his head. Fine, that can wait. First, he needs to figure out what he has. A horn, an anvil, coal, low-quality iron, and hands that remember only what the old Ezra knew how to do. He makes a list in his head, just like in the design bureau. The task: survive, gain a foothold, become useful, without drawing attention. And every step forward requires 2 steps to the side. If you want good steel, you need a furnace. If you want a furnace, you need fire bricks. If you want fire bricks, you need special clay. On the 3rd day, he gets up. His legs are weak, but he makes it to the furnace. He places his palm on the cold stone. He looks inside. Everything is just as bad as he expected. Heat loss is rampant. The airflow is uneven. He asks Orrin if there's anyone in town who works with clay. A potter. The old man nods. There's old Bert on the other side of town. And that very evening, a man walks into the smithy, broad-shouldered, a scar across his eyebrow, chainmail under his cloak, a working sword with a worn hilt, a guard sergeant, Holt. He throws a knife onto the workbench. The blade cracked right at the hilt. He tried to cut through bone, and the knife couldn't take it. Orrin turns the blade and spreads his hands. The metal has cracked across the sink. Forge a new one. 2 silver ones. 3 days. Holt grimaces. That's a long time for a sergeant. And then the guy by the wall steps forward. He takes the knife, turns it toward the light. The fracture is coarse-grained. They overheated it during hardening, quenched it in water, too quickly. The internal tension tore the metal apart. Classic. He looks up and asks Holt to wait until evening. No need to reforge it. The sergeant looks doubtful, but nods and leaves. Orrin turns to his apprentice, and his voice hardens. The knife is dead. The metal has cracked. You can't promise the sergeant something you can't deliver. Ezra replies that the knife isn't dead. It's just not tempered right, and he knows how to fix it. The old man falls silent. He gives him a long look, because an apprentice can't possibly know such a thing. Ezra stokes the forge. He pumps the bellows until the coals give off an even heat. He puts only the blade into the fire. He wraps the handle in a wet rag. He doesn't reforge it. He temper the steel. He heats it slowly. He watches the color of the tempering, light yellow, straw-colored, right here. He pulls out the blade and dips it into a bowl of warm oil. Not hot, 40 degrees. There are no thermometers here. He dipped a finger in the oil and waited. Hot but bearable. That's enough. The blade goes in with a quiet hiss. When the metal has cooled, he wipes the knife and strikes the blade against an oak block. Once. Hard. Not a mark on the edge. One more time. The block splits. The blade didn't even flinch. Orrin stands behind him. He's breathing heavily. He takes the knife. He tries to bend it. The metal springs back. It doesn't break. It doesn't bend dead. It springs back. The old man looks up with a question he doesn't ask. Holt returns in the evening. Ezra hands him that very knife. The sergeant turns it over in his hands. He pulls out a leather belt. He runs the blade. The cut is as clean as a razor. He asks what the boy did. Ezra shrugs. Just tempered it properly. Holt reaches into his wallet and places a silver coin on the workbench. Ezra says it's not necessary. The sergeant shakes his head. He's had that knife for 12 years, and it's never been like this. Not even when it was new. Holt leaves. The coin remains on the workbench. Orrin stands by the door for a long time. Then he turns to his apprentice. He isn't smiling. There is no mentor's pride in his gaze. There is incomprehension and the tiniest hint of fear. At night, Ezra lies on his mattress and stares into the darkness. He goes over everything he remembers from his past life. Phase diagrams, heat treatment modes treatment, the angle of the armor plate for ricochet. Everything lies in his memory in neat rows, precise, not blurred. Tomorrow he will go to the potter. He will look at the clay. If it's refractory enough, he'll start making fire bricks. He'll build a new kiln out of them, with proper air supply, with temperature control. And then comes the next step. And for a second, he allows himself to think about what no one here has ever seen. About steel that springs back instead of breaking. About bolts that fit any nut. About a wheeled machine clad in slanted armor that neither arrow nor spear can pierce. He smiles into the darkness and falls asleep, for the first time in this foreign body. In the morning, Orrin led him through the town. Hawk Hollow turned out to be smaller than Ezra's memory had painted it. One main street, paved not with stone, but with wooden planks that had swollen and split from the rain. 2-story houses. The lower story was stone. The upper story was timber with a clay plaster finish. The roofs were tiled, but every other tile was patched with straw. There weren't many people around. Merchants were opening their stalls. A couple of guards stood at the gate on the eastern side. A woman was carrying a basket of fish from the stream. The town went about its quiet, familiar life as a backwater on the border. But Ezra noticed something he hadn't noticed before. The wall around the town was old. The stones in the lower rows were covered with moss. The upper rows had crumbled in places and were propped up with wooden beams. The gate was sturdy, but the hinges were rusty. The tower above the gate was empty. Hawk Hollow wasn't expecting war. Hawk Hollow hoped the war would pass them by. Bert the Potter lived at the far end, an old house with an attached shed. Behind the shed was a pit from which he took clay. Bert turned out to be a lean, wiry old man with large hands and small eyes. He looked at Ezra suspiciously. He asked Orrin why a blacksmith needed a potter. Orrin shrugged and said that after his illness, his apprentice had become interested in strange things. Bert grunted. Ezra asked permission to look at the clay. Bert nodded toward the pit. Ezra climbed down. He crouched. He took a lump of clay and kneaded it between his fingers. Dense, oily, heavy, grayish-white with veins. He sniffed it, brought it to his tongue, licked it. Bert whistled from above and asked Orrin if the boy's head had been damaged by the fever. Orrin said nothing. Ezra didn't lick the clay out of madness. He was testing it. The taste had no noticeable acidity. The texture was fine-grained, without a sandy crunch. It could be kaolin clay, or something close to it. If it could withstand heating to 1300 degrees without cracking, then it could be used to make fire bricks. And that meant a new kiln. He climbed out of the pit. He asked Bert if he could buy 3 baskets of clay. Bert named a price. 4 copper coins per basket. Ezra glanced at Orrin. The old man sighed but reached into his purse. On the way back, Orrin was silent for a long time. Then he asked why Ezra wanted the clay. Ezra thought about how to answer. Then he said he wanted to rebuild the furnace, that the current one was losing too much heat through the walls, that if the walls were made of proper bricks, the temperature would rise and the steel would come out cleaner. Orrin stopped in the middle of the street. He turned to him. He said the furnace was 20 years old, that his father had built this furnace, that it works, that there's no need to touch something that works. Ezra nodded. He didn't argue. He said he wouldn't take apart the old furnace, that he'd build a small one next to it, a test one. If it didn't work out, he'd take it apart and that would be that. Orrin looked at him for a long time. Then he waved his hand and walked on. For 3 days, Ezra worked with clay. In the mornings, he helped Orrin in the smithy. He did what he always did. He straightened horseshoes, he sharpened tools for the farmers, he repaired door hinges. The work of his hands went by muscle memory. Ezra's hands knew the hammer and anvil, even if Daniel's mind was thinking of something else. And he was thinking of bricks. In the evenings after work, he would go behind the smithy. There, under the shed, he had set up a spot for himself. He mixed clay with fine sand from the stream. The proportions were by eye, roughly 4 parts clay to 1 part sand. He carved molds out of wood, 1 mold for each brick, 20 molds. He packed them with the mixture. He packed them down. He left them to dry under the shed. 2 days later, he took them out of the molds. 20 gray-white bricks the size of a palm, uneven, rough, but identical. Orrin came over. He looked. He shook his head. He didn't say anything. On the 4th day, Ezra fired the first batch in Orrin's old kiln. He loaded the bricks inside. He heated it up slowly. 4 hours. He pumped the bellows until his shoulders ached. He raised the temperature gradually. If you apply heat too quickly, the clay will burst from internal stress. He knew this from his material science course. When the bricks had cooled, he took them out. 3 had burst. 2 were cracked. 15 had survived. He picked one up and struck it with a hammer. The ring was clear, high-pitched, metallic. The brick didn't crumble. It didn't crumble. It held together. Orrin stood nearby. He heard that ring. He turned to Ezra, and for the first time in days, something other than wariness appeared in his eyes. Curiosity. A week later, Ezra built a small forge in the yard behind the smithy. He used his bricks. He sealed the joints with clay mortar. The forge was tiny. It could hold a single blade, but he made the nozzle differently, not straight but angled, and he connected the bellows through a clay tube that he had fired separately. The airflow became more even. He lit the forge and began to raise the temperature. Oren stood nearby with his arms crossed. He watched. When the coals reached the right heat, Ezra placed a piece of iron in the fire, an ordinary one, from the workshop supplies, the same metal Oren had been using to forge his swords and horseshoes his whole life. Only now the forge was producing a different temperature. After about 20 minutes, Ezra pulled the iron out. He placed it on a small anvil he brought from the smithy and began to forge, slowly, with even blows. He folded and forged, folded and forged. He wasn't doing anything new for this world, welding forging. Oren knew this technique, but the difference was in the temperature. The metal was heated deeper, the layers bonded more firmly. There were no cracks left. An hour later, he was holding a strip of metal in his tongs, gray, shiny at the break. He snapped off the edge and looked at the grain. Fine, uniform. It wasn't just an iron strip. It was steel. Not perfect, not alloyed, without precise control of the carbon content, but an order of magnitude better than what came out of the old furnace. He handed the strip to Oren. The old man took it, turned it over, tried to bend it, frowned, tried again. The metal sprang back. Oren looked up. There were tears in his eyes. He said nothing. He simply laid the strip on the workbench, sat down on a log by the wall, and sat there silently for a long time, looking at the small furnace in the yard that his apprentice had built from homemade bricks in a week. No metal like this had ever come out of the furnace that Oren had fired for 20 years, and he didn't know what to do with this knowledge now. In the evening, a girl came to the smithy, fair-haired, thin, a scarf on her head. Her forearms were visible beneath her rolled-up sleeves. The skin on them was rough, with pale traces of old burns. Mila Oren, the old man's daughter, 20 years old. She brought dinner, bread, thick soup in a clay pot, 2 apples. She set it on the workbench. She looked at her father. She looked at Ezra. Ezra remembered her. The memory of the old Ezra had preserved her image from when she was 13. The younger sister, she had never been to him. The girl who grew up in the smithy next to him, who also knew how to wield a hammer, even though her father didn't want to teach his daughter the blacksmith's trade, who quietly and stubbornly did things that weren't expected of her. Now she was looking at him, and he saw in her eyes the same thing he had seen in Oren's eyes. She knew he had changed. She didn't understand how. She didn't understand why, but she knew. She asked how he was feeling. He replied that he was fine. She nodded. She looked at the small forge in the yard, at the bricks, at the clay pipes. Then she turned and walked away, without asking anything. Ezra ate his soup and thought. He had to decide what to do next. The small forge was a start, proof that the principle worked. But to work properly, he needed a full-size furnace. And for a full-size furnace, he needed more bricks. And for bricks, he needed more clay. And for clay, he needed money. Holt's silver coin lay on the shelf. 1 coin. That wasn't enough. He needed an income. A steady one. Enough to buy materials and not go hungry. The next day he told Oren he wanted to try something. He took 3 knives from the stock that the old man had forged for sale. Ordinary work knives. For a butcher, a tanner, a carpenter. Oren sold them for 15 copper coins apiece. Ezra spent 2 hours with each knife for 2 hours. He heated them. He let them cool. He tempered them in warm oil. He monitored the color of the tempering. Each knife had its own regimen. Softer for the butcher, harder for the tanner. For the carpenter, with an emphasis on impact toughness. When he was done, he took the 3 knives to Will's shop, a merchant goods on Main Street. He placed them on the counter. He said they were Oren's knives, but with a new temper. He suggested Will test them. Will was a skeptic, a fat man with small, shifty eyes. He took a carpenter's knife and drove it into an oak log standing by the counter for testing. The knife went in smoothly. Will pulled it out. He looked at the edge. He drove it in again, and again. 5 strikes. The edge held. On Oren's regular knives, Nix would appear after the third strike against oak. Will looked up. He asked how much. Ezra said 30 copper coins apiece. Will grimaced. He said 20. They settled on 25. Will took all 3. That was 75 copper coins, about half a silver coin. Not much. But for 3 knives that Oren sold for 15 each, Ezra got almost twice as much. And most importantly, Will told him to bring more. Ezra returned to the smithy. He told Oren. The old man listened in silence. When Ezra finished, Oren asked how he did it. Ezra sat down across from him, looked him in the eyes, and told the first truth he could afford to tell. He said that during his fever he had dreams, fire and metal, and a voice that told him how to work with steel. He said he didn't know what it was. Maybe the gods, maybe feverish delirium. But he remembered everything he heard, and it works. Oren was silent for a long time. In this world, the gods spoke to people, rarely, not to everyone, but it happened. A feverish vision wasn't impossible. The old man looked at his apprentice, then at the small forge by the window, then back at Ezra, and slowly nodded. He didn't fully believe it, but he accepted it, because metal cannot lie, and what came out of the small horn could not lie. The rumor spread through Will. The hardware merchant could not keep quiet. A week later, people began coming to Oren's smithy, not in crowds, 1 or 2 at a time. A farmer with a dull axe, a hunter with a knife that wouldn't hold an edge, a butcher from the tavern whom Will had shown a new knife to, and who didn't believe it until he tried it himself. Ezra took their tools and did the same thing every time. The right tempering, the right hardening, temperature control based on the color of the tempering. Each time, he adjusted the process to the task at hand. A farmer's axe shouldn't be too hard, or it would chip on knots. A butcher's knife, on the other hand, needs to be hard because it cuts through soft meat. A hunting knife needs to be springy because it's sometimes used to pry things open and works like a lever. People came back after 3 days and couldn't believe what they were getting back. The very same tool, but different. The money was coming in. Slowly, but it was coming in. 10 copper coins for rehardening a knife, 15 for an axe, 20 for a cleaver. Small change, but in 2 weeks, Ezra had saved up a little over 2 silver coins. He bought more clay from Bert, made a second batch of bricks, 40 of them. He fired them in his little kiln, lost only 4. The technique had stabilized. His hands were memorizing what his head already knew. Oren watched. He said nothing. He worked as before, but sometimes Ezra caught his gaze. The old man watched his every move at the kiln, how he controlled the temperature, how he chose the cooling medium, oil for one, water for another, air for the third. Oren had been forging for 40 years, and in 40 years he had used only water. Always water. Because that's how his father had taught him, because that's how everyone did it. At the end of the 2nd week, Oren approached Ezra himself one evening. He sat down next to him on a log by the wall. He was silent for a moment. Then he asked, why oil? Ezra looked at him. It was the first time the old man had asked a question about the new technique on his own. Not with suspicion, with interest. Ezra explained simply. He said that water draws away the heat too quickly. The metal is cold on the outside, but still hot on the inside. This creates tension. Like if you pull hard on both ends of a rope, sooner or later it'll snap. Oil draws out the heat more slowly. The metal cools more evenly. There's less tension. The blade is stronger. Oren listened. He nodded. His face was focused. Then he asked why different things required different hardening. Ezra smiled. Because different things do different jobs. An axe strikes. A knife cuts. A cleaver chops. Each blow puts a different strain on the metal, so the metal has to be different. Oren was silent for a full minute. Then he said quietly that he'd been forging for 40 years and had never thought about it. That for him, steel was just steel, good or bad. But it turns out steel can be different, for different tasks. His voice sounded strange, Not hurt, not angry, lost. Like a man who suddenly realized he'd been walking the same path his whole life and didn't know there were others nearby. Ezra put his hand on the old man's shoulder. He said that Oren was the best blacksmith he knew, that his horseshoes lasted 3 times longer than any other masters in the area, that his hammer never missed, that it wasn't about knowledge, but about hands. Oren looked at him for a long time. Then he stood up and silently went into the house. But the next morning, for the first time, he asked Ezra to show him how to temper in oil. It was a turning point, a quiet one, without loud words. The old man, who had worked the same way for 40 years, sat down next to his apprentice and began to learn. Ezra demonstrated slowly. He explained every step. He didn't rush him. He didn't pressure him. Oren tempered the first knife himself. He left it in the fire too long. The tempering color turned purple. The blade turned out a bit too soft. Oren cursed. Ezra said it was fine. He demonstrated it again. Oren made the second knife better. Straw-colored, oily, well-tempered. The result wasn't perfect, but it was good. The old man turned the blade in his hands and smiled for the first time in all those days. A genuine smile, like a child who'd just been shown a magic trick. They spent the whole day together by the small forge. Ezra demonstrated, Oren repeated. By evening, the old man had made 4 knives, 2 good ones, 1 excellent, 1 unusable. Oren threw the unusable one back into the forge himself. He said he would start over. And there was more to that gesture than just work. It was a return. Ezra saw the old man's shoulders straighten. He saw his eyes sparkle. How 40 years of experience met with a new understanding and ignited something in him that he had long considered extinguished. In the 3rd week, another guest came to the smithy. Not a farmer, nor a hunter. A man in a clean doublet with a coat of arms on his shoulder, a sword at his belt, 2 guards behind him. He introduced himself as Gerard, steward to Baron Farron. Baron Farron owned the lands north of Hawk Hollow, 3 villages, a hunting lodge, 100 knights. By the standards of this world, a middle-ranking nobleman. By the standards of Hawk Hollow, a man of means. Gerard did not enter the smithy. He stood at the door. He looked down at Ezra. He said that rumors had reached the Baron about a blacksmith who made unusual things, that the Baron needed a good blade, a pair, engraved, with a silver hilt, 2 months' work, generous pay, 20 silver pieces. Ezra looked at the manager. 20 silver pieces is a fortune. It could buy 6 months of life. Clay, coal, tools, materials. But a ceremonial sword is a ceremonial sword, an ornament, a toy for a nobleman. 2 months of work on an item that would hang on the wall and never see battle. 2 months in which he could build a proper forge, make tools to sell, move forward. He looked at Oren. The old man stood by the anvil. There was anticipation in his eyes. 20 silver coins was a fortune for their smithy. To refuse the Baron meant to offend the Baron. And in this world, it wasn't worth offending people with 100 armored men. Ezra turned to Gerard. He said it would be an honor to fulfill the Baron's order. The manager nodded. He took a small pouch out of his bag. An advance, 5 silver coins. He placed it on the workbench. He turned and left. The guards followed him. Oren walked over to the workbench. He looked at the pouch. He looked at Ezra. He asked if he wasn't planning to make an ordinary ceremonial sword. Ezra shook his head. No. He was going to make a sword that would look like a ceremonial one, but function as a combat sword. A blade made of the finest steel he could get. Perfect balance, proper tempering. Engraving and silver on the hilt because the Baron was paying for it. But inside, it would be a real weapon. Because Ezra didn't make trinkets. Not even when they paid 20 silver pieces for them. Work on the sword took the following weeks. At the same time, Ezra didn't stop working on the rest. In the morning, he helped Oren with current orders. In the afternoon, he worked on the blade for the Baron. In the evening, he built. With the money from the advance, he bought a whole cartload of clay from Bert. He made 120 bricks. He lost only 8 during firing. From the rest, he began laying out a new kiln, a full-size one. with a chamber for 3 blades, with a double bellows air supply system, with a chimney for draft. The kiln grew slowly, 2 or 3 bricks a day. Ezra took his time. He checked every row. He smeared every joint with clay mortar and let it dry. If he rushed, the masonry would crack at the first firing. Mila came every evening. She brought food. She stayed. At first, she just sat by the wall and watched Ezra lay bricks. Then she started help. She mixed the mortar. She handed him bricks. Her hands were precise. She placed the brick exactly where it was needed on the first try, without asking for directions. Ezra noticed this, and he also noticed how she looked at the furnace blueprint he had drawn with charcoal on a board. She didn't ask what it was. She looked at it and tried to figure it out on her own. One evening, as the two of them were laying the top row of the chamber, she suddenly said that the line in the drawing that went inward was for air. Ezra stopped. He looked at her. She was right. That line marked the air duct. He hadn't explained the drawing to her. She had figured it out on her own. He asked how she knew. She shrugged. She said that if you need heat, you need air, and the air has to come from somewhere. So the line is a passage for air. Simple logic. But in a world where no one used blueprints, and where blacksmiths built furnaces from memory and by eye, that simple logic was worth its weight in gold. Ezra looked at her for a long time, then he nodded, and for the first time, he began to explain to her what he was drawing. Not everything, not all at once, but enough so she could help not blindly, but with an understanding of what she was doing. Mila listened eagerly. She didn't interrupt. She memorized it. And the next evening, when Ezra was delayed in the smithy, she herself laid 3 bricks exactly according to the drawing, without a mistake. Oren saw this from the smithy window. He said nothing, but Ezra noticed how the old man pressed his lips together. Not out of anger, out of something else. Maybe out of pride he didn't know how to express. Maybe out of bitterness that his daughter was learning faster than he was. Maybe both at once. Ezra forged the sword for Baron Farron from the steel of his new small forge. He chose the best piece out of 3. He forged it 12 times, each time folding and welding the layers, 4,096 layers. He stopped there. No more was needed. The grain was already fine. Any more would only make it worse. He tempered the blade zonally, not all of it the same way. The edge is hard. The heel is softer. The center is springy. 3 different properties in a single blade. To achieve this, he heated it unevenly. He coated the heel with clay. It acted as a heat insulator. When quenched in oil, the heel cooled more slowly and developed a different structure. The result was such that Ezra stopped and stared at the blade for a moment. The edge held its sharpness like a razor. The hilt bent without breaking. The middle was springy. If you struck an ordinary sword of this world with this sword, the ordinary sword would get a notch. This one wouldn't. He did the engraving himself, with acid etching. Rowena helped. He had gone to her for vinegar 2 days ago. Rowena Ash, apothecary and herbalist. Her shop was 2 streets away from the smithy. He knew of her from the memories of the former Ezra, a widow. Her husband, a knight, had died in a skirmish with the steppe warriors 2 years ago. A tall redhead with weary eyes and an ironic voice. When Ezra walked into her shop and asked for the strongest vinegar, she raised an eyebrow. She asked why a blacksmith would need vinegar. He said he wanted to paint on metal. She looked at him for a long time. Then, without a word, she pulled a dark glass bottle from under the counter. She said it wasn't just vinegar, but a distillate concentrate, a strong acid. It burns your hands if you work without gloves. She asked if he knew what he was doing. He replied that he did. She sold him the bottle and told him to come back if his fingers started peeling, without a smile. But her eyes were laughing. The sword for the Baron was ready in 5 weeks, a 3-foot blade, grooves along the back to reduce weight. The hilt was wrapped in leather with silver wire. The pommel was cast in bronze with the Farron coat of arms. The blade was engraved with acid etching, a pattern of intertwined branches. Beautiful, just as requested. But beneath the beauty lay a weapon capable of cutting through chainmail without breaking. Gerard came to pick up the sword in person, with 2 guards, just like last time. He entered the smithy. Ezra laid the sword on the workbench on a spread-out cloth. The manager picked it up with one hand, weighed it, raised an eyebrow. Light. Unusually light for a 3-foot blade. He ran his finger along the engraving, nodded, pulled his knife from his belt, and ran the blade along the edge of the sword. A scratch remained on the knife, none on the sword. Gerard looked at Ezra for a long time. Then he put the sword back in the scabbard that Ezra had made separately. He placed a small pouch with the remainder of the payment on the workbench, 15 silver coins. And he said one sentence that changed the next 2 months of Ezra's life. He said that the Baron wanted to see the blacksmith in person, not for a new order, for a conversation. It wasn't an invitation. It was an order wrapped in politeness. When the Baron's vassal says the Baron wants to see you, it means the Baron is ordering you to appear. Ezra nodded. He asked when. Gerard replied that it would be in 3 days. He turned and left. Oren stood by the wall and remained silent until the guards had disappeared around the corner. Then he looked at Ezra. There was fear in the old man's eyes. Not for himself, for Ezra. He said that Baron Farron wasn't a bad man, but he wasn't a good one either. That he gathered around him everything that could be useful to him. People, land, craftsmen. And that a blacksmith who made such swords was too useful to remain free. Ezra understood. He spent 2 days thinking. On the 3rd day, he rode to the Baron, on a horse borrowed from Will, alone. Oren wanted to go with him, but Ezra refused. He said the old man needed to look after the smithy. In truth, he didn't want to put Oren in harm's way. If the conversation went badly, let the old man stay out of it. Baron Farron's castle stood half a day's ride to the north, small, 2 towers, a wall, a dry moat, a garrison of 100 men. By Verdun standards, a sturdy outpost. By Daniel Kane's standards, a stone box that a single tank platoon could demolish in an hour. They led him into the hall. Stone walls, a fireplace, a long table, hunting trophies on the walls. Baron Farron sat in an armchair by the fireplace, about 50 years old, large, a graying beard, heavy hands with broad palms. His eyes were sharp, piercing. He wasn't stupid. Ezra realized that right away. Gerard stood nearby. 2 guards stood by the doors. The Baron didn't stand up. He gestured to the chair across from him. Ezra sat down. The Baron's sword lay on the table between them, the very same one. Farron said the sword was good, the best of those he had held in his hands, and he had held many. Then he asked how an apprentice from a backwater smithy knew what the masters of the Capitals Guild did not. Ezra answered the same as he had to Oren. Fever, visions, voices in the fire. Farron stared at him without blinking. Then he smirked. He said he didn't believe in the voices of the gods, but he believed in results, and the result was lying on the table. Then he got down to business. He wanted Ezra to move into his castle, to work for him, only for him, for no one else. A salary, blood, protection, materials, everything he needed. In return, everything Ezra forged would belong to the Baron. Ezra listened. He kept his face calm. Inside, he was calculating. If he agreed, he would get resources, iron, coal, manpower, but he would lose his freedom. Everything he made would be the property of one man. Not a single idea would leave the castle walls. No dissemination, no scale. He would become the personal plaything of a provincial baron, valuable but locked away. He looked at Farron and replied respectfully but firmly. He said he was grateful for the offer, that it was an honor for him that the Baron had noticed his work, but that he could not leave Master Oren. The old man is sick. The forge will grind to a halt without him. He asked permission to stay in Hawk Hollow and continue fulfilling the Baron's orders from there. Farron was silent. The silence lasted a long time. Gerard tensed slightly behind him. Then the Baron nodded, slowly. He said he respected loyalty, and that he valued a blacksmith who didn't abandon his mentor. But he added that the offer still stood, and that he hoped Ezra would change his mind. There was no threat in his voice, But there was no warmth either, a statement of fact. I want you. Today you said no, but I am a patient man. Ezra left the castle with a sense of relief he tried not to show. He had bought himself some time, nothing more. Ferran was not the type to forget, nor was he the type to accept a refusal forever. Back in Hawk Hollow, he set to work on the horn with redoubled energy. 15 silver coins from the Baron, plus the money he'd saved from sales, gave him the resources. He bought iron, good iron, not local, but imported from the south. 3 sacks of charcoal, some clay too, and the tools he'd been missing, new tongs, forge tongs of the right size, a file. Within a month, the forge was ready, full-sized, made of 104 fire bricks set in clay mortar. The chamber could hold 5 blades at once, double bellows, a draft pipe, a damper to regulate the air supply. Primitive by 20th century standards, revolutionary by Hollow's standards. Hollow. Ezra conducted the first firing of the new furnace himself, at night, slowly, raising the temperature 1 degree at a time. He watched the brickwork. He listened. If the brick cracks, it means there's tension somewhere. If it hums, it means the draft is good. The furnace heated up for 4 hours. When it reached operating temperature, Ezra stood in front of it and looked at the color of the fire. White. Bright. Pure. The temperature was well over 1,000 degrees, maybe 1,200, maybe 1,300. You couldn't say for sure without a thermometer, but that would be enough. Oren stood nearby. He watched the fire. He was seeing that color for the first time in his life. The old man had been forging for 40 years, and his furnace had never produced such heat. He was silent, but his hands were trembling. Not from fear, from the fact that he was a blacksmith and he was seeing before him a fire he had never dreamed of. Ezra placed the first piece of metal in the forge, a 3-pound bar of iron. He waited. He pulled it out. The metal lay white on the anvil, malleable. He began to forge, to shape. He heated it through. He added charcoal dust between the layers for carburization. This was cementation, the oldest method of making steel from iron. But with the right temperature and process control, the result was different. 3 hours later, he held a strip in his tongs, bright, with a fine grain on the fracture. He hardened it, perfectly, like the Baron's sword. Then he tempered it to the right hardness, and ran a test. He bent the strip in a vise 30 degrees. It sprang back. No cracks, no deformation. He released the vise and the strip straightened. Not quite. Almost. A residual deformation of 1/2 degree. For this world, it was fantastic. He made an axe from the steel. 1. A test piece. He took it out of town to Farmer Garrett, asked him to chop wood as usual, to come back in a week and show him the axe. A week later, Garrett came to the smithy. He laid the axe on the workbench, said he'd been chopping for 3 hours every day, oak and ash. The axe hadn't even gotten dull. He said this in a quiet voice, because his old axe would get dull in a day. He asked how much one like that cost. Ezra said 50 copper coins. Garrett paid without haggling. He left. The next day, he brought 2 neighbors. They wanted axes too. Word spread faster than Ezra expected. Within 2 weeks, all the farmers and hunters within a day's journey knew about his steel. Will, the merchant, became his regular buyer. He ordered 10 knives a week. He paid in advance. Money flowed in a steady stream. Ezra set aside every copper coin beyond his expenses. He counted. He planned. He had a clear list in his head. For the next step, he needed a crucible furnace. Not a forge, a furnace. One in which he could smelt steel, not just heat iron. One that produced stable, controllable results. One that required crucibles made of fire clay, graphite, lids, a loading system. It was a leap to an entirely new technological level, from blacksmithing to cast steel. And he knew that once he built it, there would be no turning back. Because cast steel isn't just for knives and axes anymore. It's material for something bigger, for sheets, for profiles, for structures, for armor. The entire 3rd month was spent building the crucible furnace. Ezra knew the principle. In his past life, He had seen diagrams of 18th century Sheffield crucible furnaces. A simple design, a shaft made of fire brick. Inside, crucibles stand on grates, ceramic pots with lids. Charge is loaded into each crucible, iron and a carbon source. The crucible is closed. The shaft is heated with coal. The metal inside the crucible melts. The carbon dissolves evenly into the iron. The result? Cast steel with a controlled carbon content. Homogeneous, without cavities, no slag inclusions. A whole new level. He knew the principle. The execution required dozens of on-the-spot decisions. He made the crucibles from burnt clay, but not ordinary clay. He mixed the clay with crushed quartz he found by the stream and added ash from oak charcoal. 3 components. The clay provides the shape. Quartz provides heat resistance. The ash acts as a flux and reduces porosity. He determined the proportions through trial and error. The first 5 crucibles burst during firing. The 6th held up. Ezra memorized the proportions. He made 20 more. He lost 4. 16 in total. Each crucible held about 2 pounds of metal. Not much, but enough for a start. He built the furnace shaft in the yard behind the smithy, next to the forge. The 2 structures stood side by side, the forge for hammering, the furnace for smelting. Mila helped every evening. Now she understood the blueprints well enough to lay bricks without his supervision. Ezra drew the plan on a board and went to work in the smithy. He returned an hour later. The brickwork was even, joint to joint. Her hands were more precise than Bert the Potter's, more precise than Ezra's own. She felt the material with her fingertips. She knew when the mortar had set. She knew how much pressure to apply to the brick so it would sit tight but not squeeze out the mortar. Ezra watched her and caught himself thinking the same thing every time. In another world, in his world, this girl would be an engineer, or an architect, or a surgeon. Any precise profession where hands and mind work in tandem. Here she was the blacksmith's daughter with scorched forearms, whom no one would ever call a master. He looked at her. She was laying the top row of the shaft, focused, silent. Her light hair had slipped out from under her headscarf. Her fingers were covered in clay. He walked over and told her that starting tomorrow, she would be working in the precision machining section. She stopped. She looked at him. She asked what that meant. He explained. Precision machining is when a part must be not just good, but identical. When 10 bolts must be so similar that any one fits any nut. When size matters. And that of everyone he knew, only she could do it. She was silent. Then she asked what a bolt was. Ezra laughed. For the first time in 3 months in this world, he laughed for real. And he began to explain. A week later, Mila made her first bolt. Iron. Rough. With threads cut by hand with a file along the markings Ezra had made with charcoal. It wasn't perfect, but it fit the nut that Mila had made separately. She screwed the bolt into the nut, slowly. The threads went in with difficulty, with a creak, but they went in. Mila held the assembly in her hands and looked at it. Then she looked up at Ezra. There was something in her eyes he couldn't put into a single word. Awe, joy, fear. The realization that she had just made something that had never existed in this world before. 2 pieces of iron that fit together, not by chance, by design, by calculation. She asked quietly, "Is this what you saw in the fire?" He nodded. She nodded in response. She said nothing more. But from that day on, she worked 12-hour shifts without rest. While Mila was mastering the carving, Ezra conducted his first smelting in the crucible furnace. He loaded 6 crucibles. Each contained iron shavings and pieces of charcoal. He closed the lids. He sealed the cracks with clay. He lit the shaft. He pumped the bellows for 4 hours. Orrin helped. The old man didn't fully understand what was happening, but he pumped the bellows steadily and without complaint. He was 63 years old, and he pumped the bellows as if he were 40, because he saw that his apprentice was building something he couldn't understand, and the only thing he could offer was his strength. After 4 hours, Ezra took out the crucibles. 2 had burst. In the 4 that remained, the metal had melted and solidified into a single mass. He smashed the crucibles with a hammer. Inside each lay an ingot, gray, solid, heavy. He picked one up and examined it in the light. The surface was smooth, no pits visible to the eye. He placed the ingot on the anvil and struck it. Once. The ingot rang out, a clear, high-pitched ring, like a bell. Oren heard the sound. He turned. He stood silently for about 5 seconds. Then he walked over. He took the ingot. He turned it over. He struck it himself. The same ring. The old man looked up. There were tears in his eyes. He said one word. Steel. Not iron, steel. Real steel. He had been forging for 40 years and had never heard metal ring like that. Ezra nodded. It was crucible steel, carbon steel, about 0.6% carbon, give or take. Without lab analysis, it's impossible to be more precise. But for swords, knives, and tools, it's ideal. In a past life, steel like this was forged in Sheffield in 1740. It didn't exist here and now, until this day. From the first 4 ingots, he made 4 things: a knife, a chisel point, and a spring. A knife for Sergeant Holt, for free, because Holt was the first person in this world who looked at him as an equal. The knife was perfect. The blade held sharp enough to shave with. The handle was made of deer antler. The balance was perfect. Holt came to the smithy that evening. Ezra placed the knife in front of him. The sergeant took it, turned it over in his hands, tested the blade, and stood there in silence for a long time. Then he looked at Ezra. He said that in 30 years of service he had never seen anything like it, that a blade of such quality was carried by knights, not sergeants. Ezra replied that blades are carried by those who use them, not by those who hang them on the wall. Holt smiled. He tucked the knife into his belt, and he said something that, at that moment, seemed to Ezra to be mere politeness. He said that if the blacksmith ever needed help, he knew where to find a city guard sergeant. He gave the chisel and the gouging tool to Mila for precision work. She took them and simply examined them for a few minutes. She ran her finger along the cutting edge. She tried the chisel on a bronze plate. It cut through the bronze like wood. Mila looked up. There were tears in her eyes, not from sadness, from the fact that for the first time in her life, someone had made a tool specifically for her, to fit her hand, for her work. Ezra kept the spring for himself. It was a test piece, small, the length of a palm, coiled from a strip of steel and hardened using a special process. He clenched it in his fist. Let go. It returned to its original shape, perfectly, without any residual deformation. He squeezed it again, and again, and again, 100 times. The spring returned every time. He placed it on the workbench and stared at it for a long time. Because a spring isn't just a piece of metal. A spring is a suspension spring. A suspension spring is a suspension. A suspension is the undercarriage. The undercarriage is a car, and a car is what this whole endeavor was about. But he was still a long way from a car. A very long way. For now, he couldn't even make a wheel with an iron rim because he didn't have a rolling mill. He didn't have a lathe. He had nothing but a forge, his grandfather's crucible furnace, a dozen steel ingots, and 3 people. Himself, Orina, and Mila. But the spring lay on the workbench, springing, and in that lay hope. At the end of the 3rd month, news arrived in Hawk Hollow. Bad news. A messenger from the capital rode through the city at dawn and didn't stop, but the guard at the gate heard him shouting to the relief guard as he passed. The horde had crossed the Grey Ridges. 20,000 horsemen. The eastern counties were burning. The royal army was on the move, but it was outnumbered. The town was in an uproar. People began buying up grain. Merchants were jacking up prices. Guards patrolled the walls more frequently. Sergeant Holt doubled the patrols. That evening, he stopped by the tavern. Not for a knife, just for a chat. He sat down on a log. He looked at Ezra. He said that Hawk Hollow was 2 weeks' march from the ridges, that if the army didn't stop the horde, the city would be in their path, that the walls were old, the garrison was small. If 10,000 horsemen came, the city would fall in a day. Ezra listened. He knew this. Ezra's memory held stories of the steppe warriors, swift, cruel, horse archers. They don't storm the walls. They go around them, cut them off, burn the fields, wait until the city surrenders from hunger. Or they just pass by, leaving ashes in their wake. Holt asked directly, could the blacksmith do anything for the city? Arrowheads, reinforcements for the gates, anything. Ezra was silent. He thought. Then he said he would make the arrowheads and the reinforcements, but that he needed something else, time and people. 2 assistants, not apprentices, but strong guys who could pump bellows and haul heavy loads. Holt nodded, said he'd find them, in the morning. When the sergeant left, Ezra sat down at his drawing board and began to sketch. Not arrowheads, not fortifications. He was drawing a cart, a 2-axle cart, with high sides, with slanted sheets on the sides, an angle of 30 degrees from the vertical, enough so that an arrow would slide off upon impact rather than pierce through. The sheet was 4 lines thick. He didn't know exactly how much that was in millimeters by local standards, but about 3 millimeters. That's not enough for serious protection, but it's enough for an arrow or a light spear on impact. Loopholes. 2. On the sides, narrow, for archers, protection from above against flanking fire. A closed compartment in front for the pair of draft horses. The horses are protected because dead horses mean a dead wagon. He drew for an hour, erased. He drew again. He calculated in his head, weight, axle load, track width, turning radius. He had no paper, no pencil, no ruler, just charcoal and an oak board. But the drawing came out clean, because the engineer's hands remembered, even if the fingers were someone else's. He finished after midnight. He stood up. He looked at the board. The world's first drawing of an armored vehicle that had never seen gunpowder. Not a tank, not even close. A horse-drawn cart with sloped armor and gun ports. By 20th century standards, a toy. By Verdun's standards, it would be as if a dragon had suddenly appeared on the battlefield. He blew out the lamp, lay down on the mattress. He closed his eyes. For the first time since waking up in this body, he wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about the war. About the 20,000 horsemen marching from the east. About the ancient walls of Hawk Hollow. About the young guards on those walls. About Sergeant Holt, who had asked if the blacksmith could help. And he knew the answer. Maybe. If he was given time. Holt brought 2 men the next morning. The first was Graham, 26 years old, a former bricklayer, a broad-shouldered, quiet guy with hands the size of shovels. The second was Tobin, 19, a skinny, lanky former stable hand, quick and nimble. Both were out of work. Both were willing to do whatever they were told for a copper a day. Ezra looked at them, then at Orrin. The old man shrugged, as if to say, "It's your idea, so you're in charge." Ezra put Graham on the bellows and heavy lifting, Tobin on coal preparation and cleanup. He explained the rules. We work from dawn till dusk, 5 minutes rest every hour, a half-hour lunch break. Graham and Tobin exchanged glances. 5 minutes of rest every hour? They'd never heard of such a thing. Here, workers toiled until they dropped. Tobin asked if the foreman was joking. Ezra said he wasn't, that a tired worker makes mistakes, and mistakes mean wasted metal, wasted time, and wasted money. Graham nodded first. Tobin followed suit. After a week, they stopped asking. After 2 weeks, they were announcing the breaks themselves and sitting down to drink water. The work was moving along. Ezra divided it into 2 streams. The first stream, bread. Knives, axes, chisels, arrowheads, anything that could be sold or traded right now. Money was needed every day. Coal costs money. Iron costs money. Clay costs money. Food costs money. The second stream was construction. He made the arrowheads for Holt in 3 days. 200 pieces of crucible steel, each one identical. Same weight, same shape, same sharpening angle. When Holt saw them laid out in rows on the workbench, he stood there silently for a long time. He was used to arrowheads that were all different. Some were more crooked than others. Some were heavier. Every archer adjusts the arrowhead to fit his own arrow, but here were 200, all identical. He picked up 2 arrowheads, placed them side by side. They matched. He picked up a third. It matched. He looked up and asked Ezra how this was possible. Ezra explained it simply. He said he had made a mold, just one, and poured metal into it. Every arrowhead is a copy of the mold, and there is only one mold, so all the copies are identical. Holt looked at him as if Ezra had just explained to him that the earth is round. The idea of a mold for casting was not new. Foundrymen in the capital cast bronze bells. But to apply casting to arrowheads, on a massive scale, identically, it was so obvious and yet so untried that the sergeant, a 30-year-old veteran, was at a loss for words. He took the arrowheads, distributed them to the archers. He came back in the evening, said the archers were thrilled, that the arrows flew straighter because the weight was uniform, that the edge held after 3 shots into an oak shield, that his men were asking if they could have more. Ezra said yes, as long as there was iron and coal. Alongside the arrowheads, he began making something he hadn't shown to anyone but Mila. Steel sheets. Not forged plates like they made here for armor, but sheets, smooth, of uniform thickness, as much as that was even possible without a rolling mill. He forged them from ingots of crucible steel, flattened them with a hammer on an anvil, slowly, evenly, turning the workpiece after every 3 blows. Then he trimmed the edges, smoothed the surface with a file. He checked the thickness, not with a ruler. There was no ruler. A vernier caliper, certainly not. He checked with a bracket. He carved a pea-shaped bracket out of wood with a gap of 4 lines. If the sheet fit into the bracket, it meant it wasn't thicker than 4 lines. If it didn't rattle, it meant it wasn't thinner. Rough, primitive, but it worked. In 2 weeks, he made 8 sheets. Each was about 2 feet by 1.5, 4 lines thick, give or take. 8 sheets isn't enough. You need at least 6 for one side of the wagon. And there are 4 sides, plus the roof, plus protection for the horses. That's about 30 sheets total. At his pace, that's 3 months of work just on the armor, not counting the wheel frames, axles, and everything else. He needed another way, and he knew what it was. But for that, he had to build one more thing, a rolling mill. The words sounded impressive. The reality was simpler. 2 cylindrical rolls made of hardened steel, an oak frame, a feed lever. The workpiece passes between the rolls and is flattened to the desired thickness. No motor, manual drive, or horse-powered if he could adapt it. The principle was the same as that of his grandmother's dough roller, only metal instead of dough and steel rolls instead of a wooden rolling pin. He drew a sketch on the board. He showed it to Mila. She looked at it. She asked how to make round rollers. Ezra nodded. Good question, the best one, because round rollers require lathe work, and he doesn't have a lathe, and he can't have one, for now. He solved the problem another way. Instead of perfectly round rollers, he made faceted ones, octagonal. He forged 2 steel bars. He cut 8 facets into each one. He sanded them down as best he could. The result was far from ideal. The rollers left marks from the facets on the sheet. The surface wasn't smooth, but slightly ribbed. But the thickness was uniform. And that was the main thing. Graham put the frame together. The bricklayer turned out to be a decent carpenter. Oak beams, wedges, fastened with wooden pegs, rough but sturdy. A lever made of ash, 2 men tall. The 4 of them made the first pass together. Ezra and Mila at the rollers, Graham at the lever. Tobin fed the workpiece, a steel strip heated until it glowed yellow. It slid between the rollers. Graham leaned on the lever. The rollers turned. The strip came out the other side, thinner, smoother, with slight traces of the edges, but uniform thickness along its entire length. Ezra took the sheet, checked it with a caliper. 4 lines, across the entire surface. He looked at Mila. She was looking at the sheet, then at the mill, then at Ezra, and she nodded, without a word. She understood. This changed everything. 1 sheet in 20 minutes instead of half a day's work. 6 sheets a day instead of 1 every 2 days. A switch flipped in Ezra's head. From that moment on, he stopped thinking in terms of individual pieces. He began to think in a stream. Rowena Ash appeared in the forge a day after the first rolling. She didn't come on business. She came out of curiosity. Half the town had heard the roar of the rolling mill and was wondering what was happening behind Orrin's smithy. Rowena walked in without knocking. She stopped at the door. She looked at the rolling mill, at the sheets stacked against the wall, at the bellows and the crucible furnace, at Graham and Tobin pumping the bellows, at Mila, who was filing the edge of a sheet, at Ezra, who stood by the drawing board, counting something on his fingers. She was silent for a moment. Then she said she'd come to ask if he needed any more vinegar. Ezra turned around. He looked at her. Rowena stood in the doorway, tall, her red hair pulled back at the nape of her neck, an herbal apron over a dark dress, in her hands a basket with bottles. He said he didn't need vinegar, but he needed potash. She raised an eyebrow, asked why. He explained, potash for flux. Flux helps when welding metal. It lowers the melting point of oxides on the surface. The metal welds cleaner. He spoke and saw Rowena's expression. She didn't understand every word, but she understood the principle, because she's a chemist. Let her call it herbalism. Let her work with decoctions and infusions rather than flasks and retorts. But she knows what proportion is, what concentration is, what a substance's reaction to heat is. He fell silent. She stood there and looked at him. Then she asked quietly, "You saw all this in a fever?" He nodded. She shook her head. She said she didn't believe in feverish visions, but she believed in what was standing against the wall. She pointed to the steel plates. She said that her late husband, a knight, wore a breastplate thicker than these plates, and that even he hadn't protected him from a step spear. And these plates looked different. She asked if an arrow would pierce such a plate. Ezra took one of the plates, leaned it against an oak post of the canopy, stepped back 20 paces, nodded to Tobin. The boy drew his bow. Ezra himself chose an arrow with a standard forged tip, not a crucible forged one, a standard one, the kind every blacksmith in Verdun makes. Tobin fired. The arrow struck the sheet, with a ringing sound, and bounced off. A dent no deeper than a scratch remained on the sheet. Rowena approached. She ran her finger over the dent. She looked at Ezra. She said nothing. But that evening she sent a boy messenger with 3 pounds of potash, for free, and a note. The note contained a single sentence: "If you ever need someone who knows about powders and mixtures, you know where to find me." Ezra hired 2 assistants, Graham and Tobin, and set up production of identical arrowheads using the casting method. He built a hand-operated rolling mill with faceted rolls and began making steel sheets of uniform thickness. Rowena Ash came to the forge, saw the work, and offered her help as a chemist. The 4th month began with bad news and good. The bad news came from a messenger. The eastern county of Marshfield had fallen. The horde burned 3 towns and 12 villages. The royal army had fought a battle at the Stone River crossing and retreated, losing 400 knights. 400. For a kingdom with only a few thousand knights, it was like losing an arm. Hawk Hollow was in an uproar. People were packing their belongings. Merchants were locking up their shops. Farmers from the surrounding farms were streaming into town with carts full of goods. The walls were old. The garrison numbered 60 men. Everyone understood that if the horde turned south, the city would not hold out. Holt walked the walls every day. He inspected, he counted, he oversaw the repairs. Orrin was counting too. He was counting the iron and coal supplies. He was counting how many arrowheads he could make. He was counting and keeping quiet. The good news was small and personal. Mila had made a 2nd bolt, and a 3rd, and a 10th. By the end of the week, she had 20 bolts and 20 nuts, all identical, all fit together, any bolt to any nut. Ezra laid them out on the workbench and asked Orrin to take any bolt and any nut. The old man took one. tightened it. It fit. He took another pair. It fit. A third. It fit. Oren stood there looking at the 20 bolts and 20 nuts that all fit together. Then he looked at his daughter. Then at Ezra, and quietly said that he didn't understand why this was necessary, but felt that it was more important than anything he'd seen in 63 years. Ezra nodded. He explained. He said that if every part is unique, then every breakdown is a disaster. You need a craftsman who can make a new part that's exactly the same. But if the parts are identical, you just swap the broken one for a spare. Any soldier, in the field, without a forge, in a minute. Oren was silent for a long time. Then he said that this would change the world. Ezra replied that that was what he was hoping for. He began building the cart at the end of the 4th month. He made the frame out of oak, not because wood is the best material for a frame, but because there wasn't enough steel. The steel went into the sheets, the axles, the fasteners, the parts that bear the load and absorb the impact. Everything else was made of wood. 4 wheels, each with an iron rim. The rim wasn't solid, but consisted of 4 segments fastened together with Mila bolts. The axles were steel, forged from crucible steel, solid, not hollow, heavy, but strong. The suspension. This is where Ezra paused. The blueprint called for springs, leaf springs, a stack of 4 steel strips of varying lengths, just like on 19th century wagons. He knew how to calculate them. He knew what kind of bend was needed, what thickness, what hardening. But each spring required 4 strips of steel, 16 strips for 4 wheels. That's 16 ingots of crucible steel. His furnace produced 4 ingots per melt, 4 melts, 4 hours each. 2 days of work just on the springs. Provided that not a single crucible burst. He sat over the drawing and calculated. Then he stood up. He went to Roven. Roven Ash was already working with him by this time. Not officially. She still ran the apothecary, but 3 times a week she came to the smithy for 2 hours. Ezra gave her a task. Potash, nitrate, sulfur, everything related to chemical additives for metallurgy and beyond. Rowena turned out to be exactly who he'd hoped she'd be. Smart, precise, meticulous. When he explained to her what a flux was and why it was needed, she didn't just understand. In 3 days, she found 4 different mixtures in her supplies that could work as a flux. She gathered 2 from her own herbs. She bought the 3rd from a passing merchant. She made the 4th one herself. She mixed potash with crushed river sand and calcined it in a crucible. The result was rough, but it worked. Now Ezra had come to her with another question. He needed lubricant, for axles, for the mechanisms of the rolling mill, for everything that rotates and rubs. In his world, it was grease or lube. Here, there was neither. Rowena listened to him. She asked what properties were needed. He explained. Thick, doesn't run, doesn't dry out quickly, withstands heat, reduces friction. She nodded, said she knew. Animal fat boiled down with ash and thickened with beeswax. Not ideal, but it would do for the axles. 2 days later, she brought a pot of thick, yellowish mass. Ezra applied it to the rolling mill's axle. The mill began to turn more easily. The lever moved more smoothly. Graham, who leaned his full weight on that lever every day, looked at the pot as if it were a sacred object. Building the wagon took 6 weeks, every day from dawn to dusk. Oren forged the parts according to Ezra's drawings. The old man no longer asked why. He simply forged. His skill, honed over 40 years of experience and combined with the new steel, produced results that Ezra could not achieve with his own hands. Oren's hinges were perfect. The staples were precise. The rivets were as uniform as if cast from a single mold. The old man worked in silence, intently. And sometimes Ezra saw an expression on his face he hadn't seen before. Peace. Oren was finally making things worthy of his craftsmanship. Mila assembled the small joints, bolt connections, sheet metal fasteners, emporium hinges. Her fingers worked with a precision that made Ezra's heart skip a beat every time. She fitted the parts together so that the bolt went in without a hammer, by hand, with a light touch, and held it tight. Graham worked with wood, the frame, the sides, the floor, the seats. Ezra gave him the measurements, and the mason cut everything exactly as per the blueprint. Not because he knew how to read blueprints, but because Ezra had made templates for him, wooden templates. He placed them and cut. Simple, reliable, protection against mistakes. Tobin ran back and forth between everyone, passing things, carrying things away, pumping the bellows. He stoked the forge, he cleared away the shavings, and he learned, silently, eagerly. Ezra saw how the boy memorized his every move. 5 weeks later, the wagon stood in the yard behind the smithy, unarmored, a bare frame on 4 wheels with axles, resembling the skeleton of a huge animal. Ezra walked around it. He checked every joint. He rocked the frame. He hung onto the side. He tapped the axles. He spun the wheels. They turned smoothly, lubricated with Rowena's grease, without a squeak. Then he began to sheath it, sheet by sheet. Each was fastened to the frame with Mila bolts through an oak spacer. The spacer was needed so that upon impact from an arrow or spear, the energy wouldn't go directly into the frame, but would be absorbed by the wood, a primitive shock absorber. He placed the sheets at an angle, 30 degrees, the lower edge of the angle, the upper edge inward. An arrow hitting such a plate slides upward and goes wide. It doesn't penetrate. It ricochets. Daniel Kane knew this principle like the back of his hand. Sloped armor, the foundation of tank design since the 1930s. The plating took another week. When the last sheet was in place and Mila tightened the final bolt, Ezra stepped back 10 paces and looked. A wagon stood in the blacksmith's yard, a 2-axle wagon, with high, slanted sides made of steel sheets, with embrasures on the sides, with an enclosed compartment in front for the horses, with a hinged hatch in the back for the crew. Ugly, rough, angular, gray from untreated metal, but it stood there, on its own wheels, on its own springs, on its own axles, and it was the first. Oren came out of the smithy. He stood next to Ezra. He looked at it for a long time. Then he quietly asked what it was. Ezra answered with one word: defense. The tests began the next morning. Ezra called for Holt. The sergeant came with 3 guards. He stood in front of the wagon, walked around it, tapped the side with his fist. The metal gave off a dull, short sound. Holt crouched down, peered under the bottom, felt the springs, stood up, looked at Ezra. He said he'd seen siege towers on wheels, but those were wooden and burned up from a single flaming arrow. This was different. Ezra nodded. He asked the sergeant to line up the archers 20 paces away, the standard combat distance for archers. 3 guards stood in a line, bows drawn, arrows with standard forged tips. Ezra stood to the side. He shouted, "Fire!" 3 arrows struck the hole. A clang, sparks. 1 bounced off. 2 got stuck in the gaps between the plates. None penetrated. Holt stepped forward. He pulled an arrow from the gap. He looked at the tip. Dented. Bent. The plate beneath it was dented but intact. The sergeant grunted. He ordered them to shoot again. 10 arrows, 20, 30, from various distances, from 10 paces, almost point blank. The result was the same. Dents, scratches, not a single penetration. Holt put away the bow. He looked at Ezra. He asked about the spear. Ezra nodded. Graham took a guard's training spear. He took a running start. He struck the side. The spear slid up the slanted plate and went off to the side. Graham nearly fell from the momentum. The slanted armor worked. The spear couldn't penetrate straight on. The angle of the plate deflected the tip. Holt watched. He was silent. Then he turned to Ezra and said 2 words. "Show me the inside." Ezra opened the rear hatch. Holt climbed in. It was cramped inside. 2 benches on either side. Loopholes at eye level. Through each loophole, the field was visible. With Archer sits inside, protected on all sides. He shoots through a narrow slit. It's almost impossible to hit him from the outside. Holt sat down on a bench. He looked through the embrasure. He took his bow. He nocked an arrow. He took aim. He shot through the embrasure. The arrow flew true. He shot again, and again. 3 arrows, 3 shots, all on target. The sergeant lowered his bow. He sat down. He was silent for a long time. Then he climbed out. He walked over to Ezra. He stood in front of him and said nothing. Ezra waited. Holt said that if he'd had a thing like this 2 years ago at Stone River, he wouldn't have lost 6 friends. His voice was steady, without a tremor, but his eyes were wet. Then it was the horse's turn. Ezra had made a deal with Will the merchant. He'd lent him a couple of pack horses for the day. The horses were led into the front compartment. They were harnessed. The compartment was cramped, but both fit inside. The walls enclosed them on the sides and above. Only their legs were exposed. That was a problem. Ezra knew it. But he hadn't figured it out yet. The protective skirts for the horses' legs required 2 more sheets of steel. They didn't have that yet. Tobin sat on the box. He snapped the reins. The horses moved. The wagon rolled, slowly, heavily, with the springs creaking. But it rolled. They circled the yard. Then they drove out onto the street. People stopped and watched. A steel box on wheels rolled down Hawk Hollow. Children ran alongside. Shopkeepers came out of their stores. Some laughed. Some crossed themselves in the local manner. Bert the potter stood by his house and shook his head. They drove out the gate, onto the road. Here it became more difficult. The road was rutted. Ruts. Stones. The springs were working, but the jostling was severe. Inside the wagon, Holt and one guard were being tossed about like peas in a can. Holt climbed out. He said it wasn't a walk in the park to ride inside. It's bumpy, it's noisy, it's hot. But you can sit, you can shoot, you can survive. Ezra nodded. He made a mental note. We need soft cushions on the benches, felt padding, straps for the shooters so they don't get tossed from side to side. Straps. That's a job for a saddler, or for someone who knows leather harnesses. He didn't have that person yet. They returned to town. They drove the wagon into the blacksmith's yard. Ezra spent the evening on a list of improvements. 23 items. From reinforcing the springs to ventilating the interior. 23 problems. Each solvable, but each requiring time and materials. At night, he lay awake and did the math. He had silver from sales. Not much. A month's supply of iron, 3 weeks' worth of coal, 4 men in the crew, a horn, a furnace, a forge, and 1 wagon that was currently only good for a demonstration. It was far from a combat vehicle. A second crew was needed, and a third. Archers trained to shoot from embrasures were needed. Tactics were needed. A doctrine of use was needed. 1 vehicle solves nothing on the battlefield. 10 can. 20 will change the rules. He closed his eyes and thought about what he had been trying not to think about until now. About scale. Oren's forge couldn't handle mass production. It physically couldn't. 4 people couldn't build 2 vehicles a month. They needed resources that didn't exist in Hawk Hollow. Iron in industrial quantities, tons of coal, craftsmen, apprentices, a place. A big place with a roof and walls, with a testing ground, with a stable for draft horses. He needed a base, a real one. And he knew there was only one way to get it, to attract the crown's attention. For the next 3 days, he fine-tuned the wagon. He eliminated squeaks. He replaced 1 sheet that, upon inspection, turned out to be thinner than the rest. He tightened the bolts. He added felt padding inside. Rowena brought a rust-preventive treatment, a mixture of linseed oil and wax, thick, dark. It worked quite well. After the treatment, the sheets turned matte black. The wagon no longer looked like an iron box. It began to look like a weapon. On the 4th day, Gerard arrived, Baron Ferran's steward, alone, without guards. He walked into the courtyard. He saw the wagon. He stopped. He stood silently for a minute. Then he walked around it. He touched the side. He peered through the loophole. He crouched down by the wheel. He felt the spring. He stood up. He looked at Ezra. His face was calm, but his eyes gave him away. He was stunned. He said the Baron had heard about something unusual in the blacksmith's yard, and he'd sent him to take a look. Ezra didn't hide anything. There was no point in hiding a wagon standing in a courtyard in a small town. He opened the hatch, showed Gerard the inside, explained the principle. Sloped armor. The arrow slides off. The spear slips off. The crew is protected. The archers fire through the embrasures. The horses are sheltered. Gerard listened in silence. Then he asked a single question. He asked how many such wagons 100 horsemen could stop. Ezra answered, 3. 3 wagons with a crew of 9 archers, against 100 horsemen. If the archers are good. Gerard looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded, turned, and left, without saying goodbye. Ezra stood and watched him go. He knew what would happen next. Gerard would report to Ferran. Ferran would want the wagon, or all the wagons, or Ezra himself. The only question was what the Baron would propose, and what he would do if Ezra refused again. Ferran didn't wait. 2 days after Gerard's visit, a detachment rode up to the gates of Hawk Hollow. 30 horsemen in full armor, chainmail, shields, spears. The Baron at the head, on a war horse, in a cloak bearing his coat of arms. The town froze. 30 armored men was a quarter of the Baron's own garrison, a serious force for a town with 60 guards. Holt met them at the gates. The conversation was brief. The Baron said he had come on a visit, not a military one, a friendly. He wants to see the blacksmith and his work. Holt let them in. He had no choice. A baron is a baron. Ferran rode up to Oren's smithy, dismounted. The guards remained on horseback, forming a ring around the courtyard. Ezra came out to meet them. Oren stood behind him. Mila Graham and Tobin were inside. Rowena watched from the window of her shop across the street. The Baron examined the wagon, slowly, carefully, not like Gerard, more thoroughly. He had been a warrior himself. He had fought for 20 years. He had seen sieges and field battles. He understood what was before him. He walked around the wagon 3 times, climbed inside, sat on the bench, looked through the loophole, climbed out, felt the springs, rocked the wagon with his hand, checked how the wheels turned, stood in front of Ezra, and spoke. He said he wouldn't repeat his old offer, that he understood the blacksmith had refused and respected his reasons. But times were different now. The horde was coming. Marchfield had fallen. If the steppe tribes turned south, they'd be here in 2 months. And that this wagon could save not only Hawk Hollow, but also his lands, his villages, his people. He proposed an alliance, not service, an alliance. Farron would provide iron, the best from his mines in the north. He's providing coal from his forests. He's providing 20 workers. He's providing silver for materials. Ezra is building the wagons, 5 of them, owned by Farron, with crews that Ezra will train. Anything beyond the 5 belongs to Ezra. Ezra listened. He considered it. The offer was better than he expected. Farron was smarter than he seemed. He wasn't trying to subjugate. He was trying to buy a stake in the outcome, like an investor. But there was a problem. 5 wagons meant at least 6 months of work. Ferran's iron was of unknown quality. 20 workers who needed to be trained from scratch. And most importantly, if Ezra accepted the Baron's iron and silver, he would become his debtor. Not legally, in fact, in a world where debt is a chain. He looked at Ferran and offered something else. Not 5 wagons, 3. Not for iron and silver, for the right to use the Baron's mines independently, with his own people, his own ore, his own coal. 3 wagons was the price for access to the resources. Ferran narrowed his eyes. It was tougher than he'd expected. The blacksmith was haggling like a merchant. Ferran's mines supplied iron to the entire region. Granting a stranger access to them meant giving him independence. The silence dragged on. Oren, standing behind Ezra, held his breath. Then Ferran smirked. He said the blacksmith was either smarter than he looked or completely mad. And he agreed. They shook hands, in front of witnesses, Holt, Oren, Gerard, all verbal. Here, paper was signed only for royal decrees. A baron's word is law in his lands. Ferran left. 30 horsemen rode back north. The dust settled. The town breathed a sigh of relief. Oren turned to Ezra. He said that he had either saved them or sold them out. Ezra replied that he hoped for the former. Over the next 2 weeks, everything changed. The first shipment of ore arrived from Farron's mines, 3 carts. Zira inspected it. The ore was better than he'd expected. Brown iron ore with a high metal content, low sulfur, low phosphorus, good raw material. Coal arrived next, oak-based, dense, high calorie. With these resources, the scale of operations changed. Ezra hired 6 more men, 2 for the bellows and hauling, 2 for woodworking, 1 blacksmith from a neighboring town, a guy named Wes, young, smart, not a master, but a strong apprentice with good hands, and 1 foundryman, an old man named Dagon from a village a day's journey away. He'd been casting bronze buckles and bells for 30 years. Bronze isn't steel, but he knew the principles of casting. Ezra would teach him the rest. The yard behind the smithy had expanded. Sheds, workbenches, a second forge, a coal storage shed, an ore storage shed, a kiln for firing bricks, a spot for a rolling mill. Hawk Hollow didn't know it yet, but a factory was growing in its backyards, the first in this world. Mila took charge of the section. Ezra gave her 3 men. Their task was precision work, bolts, nuts, axles, anything that required repetition. Mila taught them just as Ezra had taught her, patiently, step by step, with templates and patterns. Within a week, 2 of the 3 were making bolts just as well as she was. The third struggled. His hands were rough. His fingers were used to an axe, not a file. Mila didn't let him go. She sat beside him for hours, showing him, guiding him. On the 10th day, he made a bolt that passed inspection. Mila put it in the shared box with the rest. The guy looked at that box as if his bolt had made it into the royal treasury. Ezra watched, and in that moment, he understood what he had known in theory, but now felt in practice. Mila isn't just an employee. She's a leader. She knows how to teach. She knows how to wait. She knows how to demand without humiliating. She knows how to put a person in a place where they can flourish. He approached her that evening. He pulled a bundle from behind the workbench. He unwrapped it. Inside lay a case, leather, with a clasp. Mila opened it. 12 tools. Files of various profiles, scrapers, a center punch, a small hammer, pliers with thin jaws, every item made of crucible steel, each one fitted to her palm, the handles shaped to the thickness of her fingers, 2 letters engraved on every tool, M and O, Mila Oren. She stood there, staring into the case. Fingers that never trembled while working were trembling now. She looked up, opened her mouth, closed it, couldn't say a word. Then she simply pressed the case to her chest with both hands, and stood like that for a full minute. Ezra didn't say anything, because words weren't needed. He turned and walked to the workbench. Behind him, Mila exhaled quietly and went back to work, with new tools. The second wagon was finished faster, 3 weeks instead of 6, because the templates were already there, because people knew the order, because Mila stamped out bolts like a machine and Oren forged parts without a second thought. There was no assembly line yet, but the principle of division of labor worked. Everyone did their part, not everything at once, but one operation, and they did it well. The third wagon was finished another 2.5 weeks later. Ezra stood in the yard and looked at the 3 machines lined up in a row. Identical. Gray-black from Rovina's impregnation. Angular, heavy, fearsome-looking. Beautiful. Beautiful to him. Because a machine's beauty isn't in its form, it's in its function. In the fact that every bolt is in place, every sheet at the right angle, every wheel turns smoothly. 3 machines, a crew of 3 men for each, 9 shooters protected by steel, against 100 horsemen. He promised Farron 3 wagons, but he built the 4th for himself, from the remaining resources, at night, with Mila and Oren, without assistance, because the 4th was different. He added to it what the first 3 lacked: reinforced springs, a double layer of armor plates on the front, a commander's turret on top, not for firing, for observation. A hatch with a hinged lid from which you could lean out waist deep and see the entire battlefield. And a system of signal flags. 4 flagpoles on the roof. 4 flags of different colors. red, blue, yellow, white. Each signified a command. Red, attack. Blue, retreat. Yellow, regroup. White means stop. A simple system. But in a world where commanders give orders by voice and bugle, it was like a radio. Not instantaneous, but faster than a bugle, and visible from afar. Ferrand sent Gerard to pick up his 3 vehicles. The manager arrived with 10 men. He inspected the wagons, checked each one. Ezra handed him written instructions, the first technical documentation in this world. 3 sheets of parchment, in small handwriting, how to harness them, how to drive, how to turn, how to maintain them, how to replace a damaged sheet, a list of spare parts. Gerard read for a long time. Then he looked at Ezra. He said it was the first time he'd seen a blacksmith write instructions for his own work. Ezra replied that a machine without instructions is just a hunk of metal, but with instructions, it's a weapon. Gerard led the wagons north. 10 men pulled them by hand. Ferrand would send his own horses for the draft. Ezra watched them go. 3 vehicles were heading down the road. The first 3 armored vehicles in the world of Verdun, belonging to a provincial baron. Not the king, not the marshal, a baron. That was a problem, and Ezra knew it would come back to haunt him. But for now, he had no choice. Ferrand's resources had given him a head start. Without them, he'd still be building the first machine. Now he needed the next leap forward, and for that, he needed a man he hadn't met yet. That man showed up a week later. A caravan arrived in Hawk Hollow, a small one, 5 wagons, 20 guards. A merchant from the southern city of Cheongju. He traded in spices, fabrics, and a few more interesting items. The caravan stopped for the night at the gates. The merchant went to see Will the merchant for news about the roads and prices. Among other things, Will told him about a blacksmith who made knives that wouldn't dull for a week and steel wagons from which bounce off arrows. The merchant listened. He didn't believe it, but after dinner, he went to the smithy to take a look. The merchant's name was Park Jae-sun. His daughter was with him, Kim Jae-yoon, 21 years old, short, lively, silk pants tucked into boots, silver rings on every finger, dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, quick eyes, appraising. Park Jae-sun looked at the 4th cart in the yard and politely asked what it was. Ezra explained. The merchant nodded, politely, skeptically. His daughter was silent, but her eyes roamed over the cart differently. She wasn't looking at the armor. She was looking at the bolts, at the hinges, at the joints, at how the sheets were fitted together, at the rolling mill in the corner of the courtyard, at the crucibles drying under the awning. She wasn't seeing a wagon. She was seeing a factory. When her father said goodbye and walked toward the caravan, she lingered. She turned to Ezra and asked directly how much iron he used in a month. Ezra gave her a figure. She nodded. She asked where he got it. He said from Baron Farron. She asked at what price. He answered. She whistled. Quietly, like a merchant, she said. At that price, you can buy twice as much in Cheongju, and better quality, because southern iron comes from coastal mines where the ore is purer. Ezra looked at her. He asked if her father had saltpeter. She raised an eyebrow. She asked why a blacksmith would need saltpeter. He said it wasn't just for a blacksmith. She paused. Then she said her father had everything. Saltpeter, sulfur, copper, tin, resins. Everything mined in the south and shipped north. She asked what he was offering. Ezra proposed a contract. Regular deliveries. Iron, coal, saltpeter, sulfur, copper. Once a month. At a fixed price. Payment in silver and goods. Knives, axes, tools made of crucible steel. In the south, these cost 10 times as much. Kim Jae-yoon listened. She was calculating in her head. He saw her eyes moving, left, up. She was calculating, quickly, precisely. Then she nodded, said she'd discuss it with her father, but that the terms were good, and that if the blacksmith wasn't lying about the quality of his steel, it was more profitable than spices. She went back to the caravan. In the morning, the caravan moved further north, but Kim Jae-yoon didn't leave. She came to the smithy at dawn, alone, with a leather bag slung over her shoulder. She said her father was traveling on, but she was staying. For a week. To see how the workshop operated, to assess the volume, to draw up an estimate. Then she would catch up with the caravan and return with the first shipment in a month. Ezra had no objection. Kim Jae-yoon spent that week in such a way that by the end of it, Ezra understood 3 things. First, she wasn't just a merchant's daughter. She had been running half of her father's business since she was 16. She knew the prices of every commodity from the coast to the capital. She knew the routes. She knew which merchants were honest and which would cheat. She knew how to get a loan from a moneylender and how to get a discount from a supplier. Second, she was hungry. Not physically. Her father had told her whole life that a woman doesn't run a business, that her task was to marry well and bear sons who would carry on the trade. She pretended to listen and quietly built her network of connections behind his back. Third, she was funny. When Ezra showed her the cart's blueprint in 3 projections, she looked at it for a long time and then asked in the most serious voice why he had drawn 3 wagons when he only had 1. He explained that it was 1 wagon viewed from 3 sides. She was silent. Then she said that the Lord Blacksmith drew like a madman, but she appreciated madmen who made money. He laughed. She smiled, the first smile all week. At the end of the week, she drew up a document for Ezra, a complete estimate of expenses and supplies for the next 3 months, with prices, with routes, with the names of suppliers, with backup options in case the main route was cut off by the steppe tribes. Ezra read this estimate and felt something inside him ease. For the first time since waking up in this world, he had found someone who thought about logistics, not about steel, not about machines, about ensuring that steel and materials arrived on time and at a reasonable price. He signed the contract with her. Not with her father, with her. Kim Jae-yoon, supplier, party to the contract. Her signature, her name. When she saw the finished contract, she was silent for a long time. Then she picked up a pen, signed her name, neatly, firmly. She tucked her copy into her bag. She looked at Ezra. She called him Lord Blacksmith, with a smirk, but her eyes were serious. She left in the morning, to catch up with her father's caravan. She promised to return in a month with the first shipment. Ezra stood at the gate and watched her go. Oren approached, stood beside him, asked if she could be trusted. Ezra replied that she could, because it's in her best interest. And in this world, self-interest is more reliable than oaths. Ezra built 4 wagons and handed 3 over to Baron Farron as per the contract. He created a flag signal system for command and the first technical documentation in the world of Verdun. Kim Jae-yoon, the daughter of a southern merchant, stayed in Hawk Hollow for a week and became a supplier to the Corps by signing a contract in her own name. Kim Jae-yoon returned 26 days later, not alone. 3 wagons traveled with her. Iron from the southern coastal mines, 2 sacks of saltpeter, a sack of sulfur, a copper ingot, a tin ingot, a barrel of resin, and something else Ezra hadn't ordered. A girl sat on the 3rd wagon, small, thin, a long black braid, a scar across her left cheek from ear to chin. She was dressed in steppe clothing, a quilted robe, boots with upturned toes. Her eyes were dark, alert, like those of a beast accustomed to being beaten by humans. Kim Jae-yoon jumped down from the cart and approached Ezra. She said she'd found her on the road between Cheongju and the pass. She'd been sitting in a ditch, hungry, beaten. A steppe girl from the Sonho tribe, the very one that had been an ally of Verdun and that the Horde had destroyed for it, the sole survivor of her clan. Her name was Sun Hee, 19 years old. Kim said she wanted to leave her in Cheongju, but she refused. She said she would go wherever the carts took her, because things couldn't get any worse than they already were. Ezra looked at Sun Hee. She stared back at him without blinking, ready to run at the first sudden movement. He asked what she could do. Kim translated. Sun Hee answered briefly. Horses, leather, harness. Ezra nodded. He said there was work, there was blood, there was food. If she wanted, she could stay. Sun Hee was silent for 5 seconds. Then she nodded. once, briefly, as if she'd snapped. She settled into a shed by Will's stable. For the first 3 days, she barely went out. She ate little. She spoke even less. On the 4th day, Ezra led her to the wagon. He showed her the harness for draft horses. Standard, bought from a local saddler. Rough work. Straps made of untreated leather. Cast bronze buckles. Fitted by eye. Sun-Hee looked at the harness. She picked up a strap. Twisted it. Pulled on it. She tried the buckle. Then she turned to Ezra and spoke her first long sentence in 4 days. She said that with this harness, you could strangle a horse, but you couldn't steer it, that the straps were too stiff, that the buckles were in the wrong places, that the breastplate restricted breathing, that the side straps were twisted, that with a harness like this, the horse would tire twice as fast and stop. Ezra listened. Then he asked if she could do better. Sun-Hee looked at him. For the first time, something other than wariness flashed in her eyes, a challenge. She said her people made the best harnesses on the steppe, that their saddles had been passed down through 4 generations, that she had sewn her first saddle at the age of 7, that she needed leather, good leather, soft, soaked, and tools, an awl, needles, a cutting knife. Ezra gave her everything. 5 days later, Sun-Hee brought the new harness. Ezra put it on the horse next to the old one. The difference was like that between a rope and silk. The straps were soft, fitted, every buckle in its place. The breastplate distributed the pull across the horse's entire chest rather than pressing down on a single point. The reins ran smoothly without twisting. The horse moved more easily in the new harness. Its stride was smoother. Its breathing was freer. Tobin, who drove the heavy carts every day, said the horses seemed like different animals. Ezra put Sun-Hee in charge of all the leather and harness work. Harnesses, carriage straps, seat suspensions, seals for embrasures, everything made of leather, all hers. She nodded and began to work, quietly, fiercely, 14 hours a day, as if proving something, not to Ezra, to herself. Production grew alongside the workforce. Kim Jae-yoon kept her word. Deliveries came regularly. The southern iron turned out to be purer than the northern iron from Faran. Less sulfur, fewer impurities. Crucible steel made from it turned out better. Ezra increased the output of ingots, 10 a day, then 15. Dagan, the old foundryman, mastered crucible smelting in 3 weeks. Not perfect, but consistent. Wes, the young blacksmith, forged springs under Oren's supervision. Graham cut frames from templates. Tobin managed the yard's logistics. He knew where everything was, how much coal was left, when the next shipment of iron would arrive. Rovina expanded her laboratory. Now she worked not in the shop, but in a separate room that Ezra had rented for her, across the street from the smithy. A table, shelves with bottles, scales, mortars, crucibles, a distillation apparatus she had assembled herself from copper tubes and a clay pot. Ezra gave her her first real task. Black powder. 3 components. 75 parts saltpeter, 15 parts charcoal, 10 parts sulfur. He knew the formula. Rowena knew how to work with the substances. The problem was the purity of the ingredients. The saltpeter Kim had brought was raw, contaminated. Rowena spent 2 days recrystallizing it, dissolving it in hot water, filtering it through cloth, evaporating it, dissolving it again, until the crystals became white and pure. She purified the sulfur by sublimation. She heated it in a sealed crucible. The sulfur vapors settled on the cold lid as pure yellow crystals. She ground the charcoal into dust. Willow, soft, burns easily. She mixed it in the correct proportions. The first test. A pinch of gunpowder on a stone slab. Rowena held a red-hot rod over it. A flash, a pop, a cloud of white smoke. The slab remained clean. Everything burned away without a trace. Rowena stood and looked at the empty slab, then at her hands, then at Ezra, who was watching from the doorway. She asked quietly, "What is it?" He answered. "Fire powder." She asked why it was needed. He answered, "So that arrows become unnecessary." She was silent for a long time. Then she asked if it was dangerous. He said yes, very. She nodded, said she would be careful, and went back to work. The black powder was still a secret. Only Ezra and Rowena knew about it. Not even Oren knew. Not because Ezra didn't trust the old man, because powder isn't a knife or a cart. Powder is the next era, and the world isn't ready for it, and he himself wasn't ready. For now, the powder was a reserve, a safety net, just in case things went wrong. The end of the 5th month, 7 machines built, 3 at Farron's, 4 at Ezra's, 22 people in the workshop. The crucible furnace runs every day. The rolling mill produces 6 sheets per shift. Mila supervises 10 people. Sun Hee handles all the leather work. Rowena runs the chemistry lab. Kim Jae-yoon oversees shipments from the south. Oren forges. Silently, precisely, tirelessly. Ezra stood at the edge of the yard that evening and looked at what had grown over 5 months from a single small furnace built from homemade bricks. And for the first time, he thought that maybe this would be enough. Maybe he would make it in time. He didn't make it, or almost didn't. News arrived at the end of the 6th month, a messenger on a worn-out horse. The horde had turned south. 10,000 horsemen, under the command of Chieftain Batur, were moving along the road toward Hawk Hollow. Not toward the town itself, toward the Ashton Ford, the only crossing over the Ashton River, 2 days' journey from the town. If they took the ford, the road to the entire southern plain would open up, and Hawk Hollow would find itself in the rear of an army marching further west, toward the capital. Holt arrived at the smithy that same night. He sat down. He rested his hands on his knees. He said he'd received an order from the capital. The Royal Army was heading for the ford. 5,000 infantry, 800 knights. Marshal Wayne is leading them personally. They'll be at the ford in 4 days. But the horde will be there in 3. The marshal needs 1 day. 1 day before the main forces arrive. Someone has to hold the horde at the crossing for a day. Ezra looked at Holt. The sergeant wasn't being explicit, but Ezra understood. He asked how many men Holt had. Holt answered, 60 guards, 20 militiamen, 80 men. Against 10,000 horsemen. Without armored vehicles, it's suicide. Ezra stood up. He paced the smithy. He counted. He had 4 vehicles, a crew of 3 for each, 12 gunners, plus Holt's 80 men. That wasn't enough. Hopelessly insufficient. But if they used the terrain... The ford was a choke point. The Ashton River was shallow there, but the banks were steep. The cavalry could only cross at the ford. The front line is 200 paces away. If we fan out 4 vehicles in front of the ford, cover the firing sectors, Holt's infantry behind the vehicles, militiamen with pikes on the flanks, that won't stop 10,000, but it will slow them down. He returned to the board, erased the old sketch, began drawing a new one, a position plan. The ford, the bank, a line of vehicles, firing sectors, dead zones. Holt looked over his shoulder. The sergeant didn't understand what a firing sector was, but he understood the map. 30 years of service, he had seen battlefields, and what Ezra was drawing was clear to him on an intuitive level. 4 boxes block the ford. Arrows fly crosswise from the embrasures. Every section of the crossing is covered by fire from at least 2 vehicles. The cavalry can't attack the vehicles head-on because the bank is steep and the horses won't be able to climb it from a running start. A flanking maneuver is impossible. The river is deep on the flanks. Holt poked his finger at the sketch. He asked, what if they just showered them with arrows from above? Overhead fire. Ezra nodded. That's a problem. The wagon's roof protects against overhead fire, but the embrasures are open. An arrow could fly into an embrasure. Unlikely, but with 1,000 archers, the odds are stacked against you, he thought. Then he drew visors over the embrasures, steel ones, sloped, covering the gap from above. The archer sees the field, but an arrow from above slides off the visor, a narrow angle, but sufficient. Holt nodded, stood up, said he'd set out the day after tomorrow at dawn, with 60 men. The militia would follow them in half a day. Ezra replied that he'd set out with him, with 4 vehicles, with 12 marksmen, whom he needs to find and train in a single day. Holt looked at him, said he'd provide the marksmen, the best ones, 12 out of 60, who can hit a pumpkin from 30 paces. Ezra replied that from 30 paces, in the heat of battle, wouldn't be enough. He needed those who could hit from 50. Holt smirked. He said he had 4 like that. We'll train the rest along the way. The next 24 hours were madness. Ezra didn't sleep. Mila didn't sleep. Oren didn't sleep. Canopies for the embrasures, 4 vehicles, 2 gun ports each, 8 canopies. Forge them, harden them, install them, overnight. Oren forged as if it were the last day of his life. The hammer never stopped. The old man struck the metal evenly and precisely, without pause, no mistakes. 63 years old, and he worked like a 30-year-old, because he knew why. Mila attached the canopies to the machines, bolts, nuts. Her hands moved in the dark by touch. She knew every bolt of every joint on these vehicles. She had assembled them. They were hers. Soon he checked the harness, every strap, every buckle. She tightened them, lubricated them, replaced a worn strap with a new one. Her horses had to pull the vehicles for 2 days on the road and then stand under fire. The harness couldn't fail. Rowena arrived at dawn. She brought a bag. In the bag were 10 paper bags, in each a handful of black powder. She said she didn't know if it would come in handy, but just in case. Ezra took the bag. He looked at Rowena. She hadn't slept either. Her eyes were red. Her hands were stained with chemicals. Her red hair was tied back haphazardly. He said thank you. She nodded. Then she told him to come back, without drama, like a fact. Just come back, that was all. They set out in the morning. 4 wagons, 8 draft horses, 12 riflemen, Holt with 60 guards, heading east, toward the Ashton Ford. Kim Jae-yoon stood at the gate, silent, hands on her belt. The rings glinted in the sun. She didn't say a word. She just stood there and watched. Mila stood next to her, silent too. 2 women at the gate saw off 4 iron boxes to war. Ezra didn't turn around, because if he had turned around, he would have seen Mila's face, and he couldn't allow himself that. Not now. The horde had turned toward Ashton Ford, and they needed to hold back 10,000 horsemen for a day until the royal army arrived. In a single night, Ezra had prepared 4 machines for battle by installing canopies over the embrasures. He set out with Holt and 60 guards toward the ford, taking with him a secret supply of black powder from Roven. It was a 2-day journey to Ashton Ford. The road wound through the hills, dusty, rutted. The wagons moved slowly. The heavy-duty wagons pulled steadily, but the springs rattled over every bump. The gunners inside were getting used to it. Holt walked alongside the first wagon, on foot, like his men. Ezra rode in the fourth, the commander's wagon. He drew a plan of the position on a board. He counted, recalculated. At the first rest stop, he gathered the gunners, 12 men. He explained the principle. You shoot through the embrasure. The field of view is narrow, about 30 degrees. The target is a mounted rider, distance from 10 to 50 paces. Don't let them get any closer. Don't waste arrows on anything farther away. Firing rate, 1 arrow every 10 heartbeats, not faster. If you go faster, you'll tire out and start missing. Aim for the horse, not the rider. The horse is bigger. It's easier to hit. A horseman without a horse is a foot soldier, and a step foot soldier on our side of the river is no threat. The archers listened. Some nodded. Some exchanged glances. They had never shot from behind a steel wall. This was new, unfamiliar, terrifying. Because you can't see the field, just a narrow strip through the embrasure, and you have to trust the commander that everything to the right and left is covered too. Ezra understood their fear. He couldn't take it away. He could only give them confidence in the steel surrounding them. He took an arrow. He stood in front of the side of the first vehicle. He struck the sheet metal with the arrowhead. The arrow bounced off. The sheet metal didn't even flinch. The archers watched. He struck again, harder. Same result. Then he handed the arrow to the nearest archer, a young guy, about 20. His hands were shaking. Ezra said, Shoot at the side, from 5 paces away. The guy drew his bow. He shot. The arrow struck the metal. A clang, a spark. The tip was dented. The metal was intact. The guy looked at the dent, then at Ezra. His hand stopped trembling. By evening on the second day, we reached the ford. The place was just as Holt had described, the Ashton River, not wide, but the banks were steep, clay and stone. The bank was 2 men tall. The ford was the only place where the bank sloped gently down to the water. The ford was 200 paces wide. The depth was up to a horse's knee. The bottom was rocky. On their side was a small elevation, a hill 50 paces from the bank. Ezra climbed the hill. He looked. The ford was like a bottleneck. The cavalry could cross only here, and once they reached this bank, they would face the ascent. After the water, the horses head uphill, slow, vulnerable, perfect. He positioned the vehicles. In a semicircle on the crest of the hill, 20 paces between vehicles. The gun ports are aimed at the ford. The firing sectors overlap. There are no blind spots. Any point on the ford is covered by fire from at least 2 vehicles. Behind the vehicles is Holt's infantry. 3 rows, spears, shields, the last line of defense in case anyone breaks through. On the flanks, militiamen with sharpened stakes driven into the ground. The stakes work against cavalry. A horse won't step on a sharp stake. The night passed in anticipation. Ezra didn't sleep. He sat in the command vehicle. He looked through the embrasure at the dark river. He thought about how in a few hours his 12 riflemen would be standing between 10,000 steppe warriors and the road to the west. 12 men in 4 steel boxes, against an army that had burned 3 counties. At dawn they appeared. First, the scouts. A dozen horsemen on the other side of the river. Small, shaggy horses. Riders in leather armor, bows on their backs. They saw the vehicles on the hill. They stopped. They stared for a long time. Then they turned and galloped away. An hour later, the horde arrived. Not all of it. The vanguard. About 2,000. They lined up on the opposite bank. A cavalry avalanche from one end to the other. Shields, spears, bows, pennants on the pikes. A roar of voices and the neighing of horses. The ground shook from the hooves even on this bank. Ezra stood in the commander's turret. He leaned out waist deep. He watched. He counted. 2,000 on the other bank. Another 8,000 would arrive during the day. He needed to hold out until tomorrow morning. Just one day. They launched their first attack an hour later. Not the entire force. 100. A test. The horsemen charged into the water with a whinny. The horses kicked up clouds of spray. They moved fast. 30 seconds to cross. They leapt onto the bank. They scrambled up the hill and came under fire. Ezra raised a red flag. Arrows flew from the embrasures. 4 vehicles, 8 embrasures, 12 archers. From 50 paces, at the horsemen climbing the hill step by step. In the first 10 seconds, 4 horses fell. In the next 10, 6 more. The 100 crashed into the hill like a wave against a rock. The horsemen, on dead and wounded horses, rolled back toward the water. Some tried to climb on foot. Holt's archers fired from behind the vehicles. 3 minutes later, the 100 had retreated. 23 horses and 9 bodies remained on the slope. Not a single rider reached the vehicles. Ezra lowered the flag. The shooting stopped. Silence on the other bank. Then noise, voices, the shouts of commanders. They didn't understand what had happened. Their warriors had gone on the attack and retreated without reaching the enemy. Arrows were flying from iron boxes that couldn't be set on fire and couldn't be pierced. The second attack came 2 hours later. 500 horsemen from 3 directions. Some crossed at the ford. Some tried to cross further upstream where the bank was slightly lower. A third group dismounted and marched along the bank, attempting to outflank them. At the ford, the vehicles met them. Same result. Arrows from the battlements. Horses fall on the ascent. Bodies roll into the water. Those who tried to cross the river further upstream were met by Holt's militiamen with stakes. The bank is steep. Wet horses cannot climb up. The militiamen jabbed them with spears from above. The foot soldiers on the bank ran into Holt's guards. Hand-to-hand combat. brief. The steppe warriors fought worse without their horses. The guards in chainmail and with swords pushed them back toward the water. 500 were driven back. More bodies on the slope, more horses. The river was murky with blood. The day wore on. The attacks continued. The third, the fourth. By noon, the steppe warriors had brought up their main forces, 5,000 on the other bank, then 7. They tried flanking fire. 1,000 archers fired a volley in an arc. Arrows fell on the vehicles, like rain, the clang of metal. Oren's canopies worked. The arrows slid off the sloped sheets and fell into the grass. 2 archers suffered cuts from shards of arrowheads that had flown into the embrasures. Nothing serious. They bandaged their wounds and returned to the embrasures. By evening, the horde had lost more than 600 men killed and wounded. Not a single one made it to the hill. Not a single one reached the vehicles. 12 archers behind steel walls held off 10,000. At night, the steppe dwellers did not attack. They lit bonfires on the other bank. Thousands of bonfires. A murmur of voices, neighing, the clang of hammers. They were preparing something. Ezra didn't sleep. He sat in the turret. He watched the fires. He knew it would be worse in the morning. They're learning. They'll come up with something. At dawn, he saw them. Shields. Large ones. Wooden. Hammered together overnight. The steppe warriors carried them in front of them, shielding themselves from the arrows. On foot. Hundreds of foot soldiers with shields were crossing the ford. Behind them, the cavalry. Arrows from the arrow slits struck the shields. Some pierced through, some didn't. The foot soldiers moved slowly but steadily, climbing the slope, 20 paces to the vehicles. 15. Ezra pulled Rowena's paper bag out of his backpack. Black powder. He wasn't going to use it as a weapon, not today. He used it as a signal. He lit the fuse. He threw the packet forward, between the vehicles and the advancing shields. The explosion was small. A pop. A flash, a cloud of white smoke, a rumble. By 20th century standards, fireworks. By the standards of a world where gunpowder doesn't exist, it was the voice of God. The foot soldiers with shields froze. The horses behind them reared up. Panic. People dropped their shields and ran. The horses carried their riders back toward the water. Ezra threw the second packet. Another explosion. More smoke. That was enough. The attack faltered. And at that moment, banners appeared on the road from the west. A golden griffin on a blue field. The Royal Army. Marshal Vane had arrived, with 5,000 infantry and 800 knights, 6 hours earlier than promised, because messengers from Hawk Hollow had told him about the iron wagons holding the ford. And the marshal had driven the army at a forced march to see it with his own eyes. The Battle of Ashton Ford lasted another 4 hours after the marshal's arrival. But it was a different battle by then. 5,000 fresh infantrymen took their positions on the bank. The knightly cavalry struck the flank of those steppe warriors who had managed to cross. Ezra's 4 machines stood in the center, like an anchor, around which the entire battle formation was built. Marshal Wayne didn't know what to do with the iron boxes, but he was smart enough not to mess with what was working. He simply positioned his troops around them, and it worked. By noon, the horde had retreated across the river, then further, behind the hills. By evening, the steppe warriors had retreated eastward. According to Holt's estimates, they had lost about 1,200 men. The Royal Army lost 109. Ezra's 4 machines lost not a single man, not a single casualty. 2 wounded by shrapnel. Both were back in action within an hour. Marshal Wayne rode up to the vehicles that evening. He dismounted. He walked around each one. He counted the arrow dents. On the first vehicle, he counted 47. On the second, 39. On the third, 51. On Ezra's command vehicle, 63. 200 dents. Not a single de. The marshal turned to Ezra, an old warrior, scars on his face, battle medals on his chainmail, 30 years of war. He asked one thing. How many such vehicles could be built in a year? Ezra answered, if he were given the resources and the men, 24. The marshal nodded. He mounted his horse, rode off. Without saying goodbye, without thanking him, he just rode off. 3 days later, a messenger arrived from the capital with a sealed letter, a seal bearing the royal griffin. Ezra opened it in the presence of Holt and the guards. A letter from Lord Chancellor Mercer, a short one. His Majesty King Liam IV invites the blacksmith Ezra Kane to the capital for an audience. Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Patreon before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations.